friends, it's Muscle Laver, your Show Up Fitness internship registered dietitian. Today, as part of our case study, we're going to talk about metabolic syndrome. What is it? Have you heard of it? If you haven't, this is why we're going to talk about it more in depth. Understanding that a majority of our population is overfed and undernourished. We see quite a bit of obesity going around, and there are some other components of that can result in metabolic disease, specifically metabolic syndrome, which is a diagnosis of 3 or more of these particular risk factors. So I want to go through and talk a little bit about each one, understanding some of the other case studies we've talked about, things like weight loss and whatnot. What are the other things going on? It's good for you to know, and finding someone to support you in that area via dietitian is important. So again, if we look at state laws, you can give nutrition facts, nutrition information. You cannot prescribe, you cannot diagnose, right? So you wouldn't have someone come to you with their labs and then you say, oh, you haven't been diagnosed with this. This is metabolic syndrome. Not the thing that you want to do. That can be problematic for you. You can't give prescriptive nutrition recommendations again. So tag teaming with a dietitian can allow for you to address this under their umbrella, under their scope, where you can work together to better support your client. But it's really, really important to understand that, because you can blur a line very quickly here. In this population, like all of our other populations, we do want to screen for disordered eating behavior. So just being aware of that. Again, 4 questions. Do they say yes to any of them? You'd be working with a dietitian. Again, you'd be working with a dietitian anyway if your client meets criteria for metabolic syndrome. So let's look at our case study. Johnny F is our mock client for today. He's the heaviest he's ever been. He has 3 kids. You know, you saw the lab work, or at least he mentioned it to you. So we know that he meets criteria for at least 3 of these: cholesterol, blood pressure, and elevated blood sugar. He's a finance guy. He works in Manhattan. He hasn't gone to the gym since the pandemic restrictions lifted. You know, you can understand by the nature of his job, it's even hard for him to do that. So what I didn't throw in here, we're talking about this person. This represents many of the finance people in New York. Actually, I've seen it one of 2 ways. Either they're navigating a situation like this, or it's actually the opposite end of the extreme, where they are triathletes or marathoners or some other like strong capacity, and I'm navigating a state of low energy availability with them. So go figure. Intense extreme personality is also important to take into context when you're talking about your client. You know, he came to you, he's looking to train at least 3 days a week, open to 4. He wants to be healthy so he can be around for his kids, and also understanding he is predisposed to medical conditions, particularly with heart disease, with history in his family. So, like anything else, we're going to start by having him create awareness of his behaviors. We want you to better understand his behaviors, where he's at, what his baseline is. And again, just reiterating some of these things. Initially, when I introduced to this, I talked to you about what metabolic syndrome is, right? The diagnostic criteria for that. I want you to understand also what the risk factors are, because if we're assessing his behaviors, sleep, stress, movement, diet, then that could also help us assess other risk factors that are not being taken into consideration. So he meets that criteria, but are there other things that we can work on as well here? Many of these risk factors are related to obesity. So again, someone who has a lot of fat mass, they're very heavy for their bone structure, for their body. The 2 most important things being the excess fat. So again, doing that waist circumference is invaluable. I do believe that is within your scope of practice to do as part of your assessment of your client. So I'm a big fan of measurements in general. We've talked a lot about weight and the scale. But measurements are such a tangible reference point to see a change. So if you do like a waist, maybe it's a thigh, you can do hips, maybe it's a bicep or a chest, like being thoughtful about the client and what their goals are. But, you know, again, a conversation to loop Chris in with, but for sure, something that you can assess. Flagging the insulin resistance, right? If they are insulin resistant, if their blood glucose is high, it just makes it difficult for their body to utilize sugar. It doesn't mean that forever they can't tolerate sugar or carbohydrates or any of this, but we do need to support